Thank you so much for this opportunity to work with you. My paper is on integrating gender in the macroeconomic policy framework, and of course with a special reference to the labor markets and the identity issues. So what I am trying to do is to identify the institutional processes of integrating gender into the macroeconomic framework using the fiscal fiat and little bit of legal fiat into my work. And I will also be looking into how we can construct the gender outcome variables and link it to the fiscal policy and the monetary policy framework. And if plausible, an econometric investigation to connect the gender outcomes and the fiscal space, or mainly the macrofiscal space. So this is the way I'm trying to plan my paper. So to begin with, this fiscal innovation processes, whether it is knowledge networking or institutional mechanisms, capacity building and the accountability mechanisms, this framework is very tough to enter into the existing kind of the macroeconomic paradigm because of the restrictions in the macroeconomic policy framework itself. One restriction is the way in which the transition happened from the discretion of the policy makers to now more or less everything is rule based. So within the rule based framework, how we can integrate the gender and the labor variables is one main thing which we need to grapple with. And second, it's for many years we have accepted the fact that the paradigm shift has not happened beyond GDP. So everything is in terms of economic growth that we need to articulate or interpret, and that is the second restriction in which the elements or the variables of gender will go into the macroeconomic policy framework. And if you look at the dimensions in which it is integrated is both from the efficiency perspective and also from the equity perspective. And here, basically three important elements I need to explain a bit more to integrate the gender concerns into the macroeconomic policy framework. The first element is how we develop the analytical matrices or the financial inputs to grapple with the existing framework. Second is how we can link the resources to the results, because everything we articulated in terms of gender in the macro policy papers were only mostly confined to the financial inputs. So the new challenge is how we can link the resources to results and how we can link the gender to the outcome budgets within the framework of within the macroeconomic policy framework. And third challenge is the forecasting errors, because we cannot just assume that whatever estimates come up is the actual or is the outcome. So what is the forecast errors and what is the significant deviation between what exactly we call as the budget estimate and the actual spending? That fiscal marksmanship of the gender-related components in the fiscal policy framework. These are the three elements which I need to highlight in my paper. And regarding the fiscal fiat, we cannot confine the analysis to the the national level, because engendering the intergovernmental transfers and the subnational governments and the third tier, that's equally important to get a big picture. So my paper is not just confined to the national level allocations, but I will be looking at the intergovernmental fiscal transfers and the subnational government expenditure. And if you look at the legal fiat, unlike Korea, we don't have a very strict legal mandate to integrate gender into the macro policy or the macro fiscal framework. What has happened in Korea, they have the national finance law. Within that, the articles related to the gender was integrated into the framework. But such kind of a legal fiat does not exist in India. And yet another example is in Philippines. By laws, they mandated that a kind of component is integrated in all the developmental sectors earmarked for the gender. So that framework is also not available in the context of India. So when I talk about the legal fiat, I have to grapple with the budget circulars. It's not legally mandated, but it's a fiscal fiat. But I have to start with the budget circulars, and whether what is mandated in the budget circular gets into the gender statements in the what do you call, in the National Union Budget's Expenditure Volume 2 at the national level, and also the demand for grants is collated at the subnational governments, then it has to be taken to the outcome. So this is a way I'm trying to, map trying to map the gender components in the demand for grants and the policy commitments. And when it comes to the legal things, I am not getting into the detail because we in India, though we have, clearly enacted the laws promoting equal conditions of women or the women's economic advancements, or our commitment, or we are signatory to the international commitments, as long as it is not translated into the fiscal framework, it will be very tough to grapple with the legal components in the context of India. So I leave it there. What I am going to highlight is, when we talk about the labor considerations, we cannot just focus the paper of integrating gender in the macro policy to the macro market framework, because a kind of dual reproductive and the predictive responsibilities that exist in the statistically invisible care economy needs to be highlighted so that we get the picture of the impact of the fiscal policies on the labor outcomes in its integrity. So the paper tries to identify all the complexities related to these aspects, which is statistically invisible otherwise, but I will be using a bit of time-use survey to arrive at a certain kind of estimates to show what is the statistically invisible component of the work done at the care economy sector, and how it can be linked to the public infrastructure considerations, and how the deficiency in the public infrastructure, in social and in the fiscal infrastructure affects the outcomes in the labor market, or how it is linked to the labor market outcomes. So here, the theoretical and the empirical links, if you look at the existing literature, so far we have talked about integrating gender in the macroeconomic framework and its linkages to the economic growth, but nothing beyond. So what I'm trying to do is that how we can integrate it in the fiscal framework and how it is linked to the gender inequality issues. So this is the question I will be looking into in my paper. So here, how I measure my gender outcomes. Of course, I have not constructed an index by myself. Rather, I will be taking the equally distributed equivalent, or that XEDE concept, or the gender sensitive equity indicator, the GESI concept of the GDI, but not GII, because I have some issues in measuring the gender development or the inequality using GII. Basically, my disagreement with the index is that it uses, or it rather confuses, the gender specific indicators with gender disaggregated indicators. For instance, if the moment you take a gender specific indicator for the reproductive health, and the moment we report the gender, the women component of that variable, we are unknowingly or knowingly assuming that the reproductive health of man is perfect, because we are putting the value 1 over there. So these kind of technical issues are there related to the gender inequality index. So I will be using the equally distributed equivalent framework and the GDI, because it's easy for me to compare with the HDI framework also, and the same normalization procedure I will be using to arrive at the indicator. Now, connecting the gender outcomes and the macrofiscal framework, I will be looking into the link between the gender outcomes, the equally distributed equivalent outcomes, with intergovernmental fiscal transfers, and also selectively some social sector variables. But beyond that, it is very tough to look at, because the time use, even using the time use variables, we won't be able to gender partition certain kind of dimensions, especially in the infrastructure. And, I won't be grappling with those kind of things using the fiscal infrastructure, how to gender partition it, but rather I will focus myself on intergovernmental fiscal transfers, the conditional and unconditional transfers, as well as a few social sector spending. And, how many minutes more I have, Shruti?
Yes, you have another 10 minutes.
Oh, wonderful. Okay.
Lekha, sorry to interrupt. Just for the audience, could you just very quickly, equally distributed equivalent income, could you just spell that out a little bit, what that concept is?
Yeah, sure, I'll do that. The Gender Development Index, that's based on 3 dimensions. We will be looking into education, health, and income. So the moment we take the education, and if you look at the Human Development Index, they are using an aggregate variable. Till 2010, they used the gross enrollment ratio and the literacy rate. But from 2010 onwards, we are using mean years of schooling. But the moment we want to disaggregate this aspect gender-wise, for instance, in the case of health also, life expectancy at the HDI level, we are using the aggregate life expectancy, but the moment we have to take it to the gender disaggregated component, we need to measure both the female and the male components. So usually, for the simplicity's sake, we can take it as F minus M as a gap, or F by M as a ratio. Otherwise, the better thing is equally distributed equivalent. It's a kind of harmonic mean, the male component is nothing but we are putting a weight like NM, the number of male in the total population, that NM is a weight. Then if we want to work it out for the life expectancy, then XM we put, and it has to be inverse. So NM into XM raised to -1, or the inverse of XM, and here X can be the variable you're working with. So the same thing, the same component you need to work out with the female counterpart also, like MNF, that is the share of female in the total population, into, if you're working for the life expectancy, XF inverse, that is the life expectancy of female inverse after the normalization procedure. And this NM XM inverse plus NF XF inverse, the whole raised to the inverse by 1 minus epsilon. And this epsilon takes the value 2, that is a penalty to the gender adjustment. So this is what is technically done. But philosophically, if you look at, you are giving weight. It's not just a gap or not just ratio, but you're putting a weight, and it's coming to a harmonic mean concept. Amit, that's fine?
Yeah. Thanks.
So this is the, thank you so much. And this is the way I arrived at that variable, the equally distributed equivalent. It's like giving penalty to the gender inequality, and you are creating a gender disaggregated variable from gender neutral index, which is a human development index. So each of the components of the human development index, using the equally distributed equivalent, we make it into a gender sensitive component. Yeah. That's fine.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. So that's about the gender, how we are going to capture the gender component. And in the existing studies, when you look at the relationship between the gender and the fiscal policy outcomes, what you see is that there is a link between the gender related public spending and education outcomes, but there is no clear linkage between the gender related spending or the gender budgeting for that time. If I articulate into a binary variable, like at the state level, if we put the states which introduce gender budgeting as 1 and states which do not introduce gender budgeting at 0, we got the result that the gender budgeting does not have any clear linkages with the labor outcomes. So what I am thinking is this outcome is mainly because the kind of fiscal policy or the public policy framed in the context of India is not looking into the statistical invisibility of the care economy. So why there is no linkage between fiscal policy and the labor outcomes? Mainly because the kind of policies we designed to improve the labor force participation has not looked into the unpaid care economy sector, and the policies required for that we need to grapple with. Because if you look at the cross-country analysis or in the Asia-Pacific context also, in our region, we don't have any clear policies to tackle the care economy aspects. So this statistical statistical invisibility, first we need to measure it and to produce as, I'm not telling that we can call it as a gross what do you call, household product, which is comparable to the GDP, but we can always make it statistically visible by using the time use survey data and impute wage or price to it. So I prefer to put wage, which is a global substitute of taking the lowest wage from the wage hierarchy in the market, because at the moment you put the pricing, the intensity of the labor may not get captured. For instance, if a woman travel 1 hour to collect the fuel load and another woman travel just half an hour to collect the fuel load, the moment you put a price to it, then both, if they are carrying the 1 quintal fuel load, both of them are going to get the equal number for that, irrespective of the intensity of the labor they put. So what I'm trying to do is putting the wage and the time, imputing the lowest wage in the wage hierarchy. What could be that statistical invisibility? We can work out and put the numbers for the 6 states in India in which the time use is conducted, because I heard from the CSO that the macro level time use survey for all the states in India is on board, and we may get the results very soon. But as long as the data allows us only to look into the 6 states of India, so that's a way I'm trying to focus on the labor, but more on the care economy aspects. And I'll stop here and take questions.
Okay, Lekha, it's very, very interesting. So we're really looking forward to the study. Just one immediate question that came to mind, and then we can go to some other ones. So the way you're doing it with imputed wage, so the question I guess at the back is whether you are interested in productivity or wages. Because in the case of the 2 examples, clearly if you were interested in productivity, then you would be looking at the price. And then one woman is lower product. So can you give us a sense for why one versus the other?
Oh yeah, because I want to go with the wages only, because the moment I get into the productive thing, the overlapping of economic activity and many such things coming, because the moment we have to look into the time grid in which a woman doing an activity, there may be a primary activity, there may be a secondary activity. So the time grids, we won't be able to scientifically split. So I will not get into the productivity aspect at all. I want to impute it through the the wages, but I understand that the specialized wages for each work done in the care economy is not readily available the data. So what I am doing is, for the rural and for the urban, I will take the available minimum wages and impute it to the time. But I won't get into the productivity, because here what we are doing is that time, non-market time and the market time and the leisure, it is trichotomized, and I will not be entering into the leisure component, but confined to the market time and the non-market time. And the market time, we can work out with the time spent on the economic activities which is related to the GDP. It's a part of GDP, but non-market time is, as per the Systems of National Accounts 1993, the extension of production boundary happened, and we included a kind of more codes into the SMA, and we called it as extended SMA, but I will be calling this extended SMA as the care economy, but not the leisure. The third part, the non-SMA component, even if we get the time spent on the non-SMA, that won't get into the calculations. We are focusing on SMA, which is directly getting into the GDP, and non-SMA as per the 1993 extension of production boundary, which are the codes entered into the SMA, that we keep as a satellite account, but not the non-SMA part. So that's the way it is. Because I thought that the allocation and the efficiency of time spent on that extended SMA components is equally relevant as the GDP related SMA components, because otherwise the overall economic well-being of the country may be at the below potential level. So like Christina, or in the vocabulary of IMF, if the fastest and the smartest way to increase the growth of the country or the growth of the nation is to improve the labor force participation of women. But the moment we focus our policies just on the market component, we are not doing a good job. It's partial, but we have to get into the extended SMA and the care economy component so that we get the whole picture. So that's the story I'm trying to highlight in the paper.
Okay, I have a couple more questions, but we can
Sure.
see if others also. Please,
Sure.
please feel free. Anybody has questions?
I have a quick clarificatory question about how would you allocate, assign some fiscal budgeting or spending as having a gender implication. Some of them are explicit schemes which are targeted towards women or girls, and that makes sense. But I was thinking about something like Narega, which has a huge impact on gender just because of having parity in wages.
Yeah.
Will that in some sense be accounted for as a gender component of fiscal spending, or will you leave that out or partition it?
Thank you for asking that question. You're right. Like we have specifically targeted programs for women, which is easy to, quantify. But the components in the mainstream, if there is an intrinsic gender component, then that's very tough to get. But here, what we really do is we look into the ex ante, like policy driven. When you design a policy, like for NREGA, it was ex ante, it was policy driven that the 40% of the scheme is meant for women. So that is an ex ante way we can do it, but it is not perfect. But ex post ways, like scheme wise, if you can get the outcomes, how many women, the state differentials in which how many women access the scheme. So if that data is available, then we can get into the outcomes. But as long as we are looking into the financial inputs, then a broad kind of a thumb rule we can apply is that threshold thing which is there in the policy statement of a particular scheme, that it is meant for women and that is this much threshold. So that's a way. But you're right that it is relatively easy for me to look into the specifically targeted programs, but the political economy of the fiscal policy and the gender outcomes is more clear into the kind of expenditure you highlighted, like Manrika. Because if you are focusing just on the specifically targeted programs, then the political economy picture will not be complete, because it is just less than 1% or 2% of the entire budget. So that is risky. But it is open-ended. The kind of expenditure we have with an intrinsic gender component is an open-ended, but Government of India has codified and quantified a kind of what do you call it? It's evolving, but we have it in the analytical metrics. And the instructions to look into those kind of schemes are there in the classification of budget transactions committee by the finance ministry. So those analytical matrices in which we ourselves collate, but it will be a Herculean task. But whatever is collated by the Government of India, that we can use, but it's an open-ended because it's not the complete picture.
Thank you.
I had one question.
Yeah.
First of all, thanks. That was an extremely interesting presentation. So just, I was wondering about one thing. So given that more or less every country nowadays practice fiscal conservatism, so is there any specific lesson that one can draw from countries which express explicitly either do gender budgeting, or countries which do better in terms of the GDIs? I mean, either in terms of the expenditure shares or the tax. I mean, where do they differ? Is it about the expenditure composition, or just the pool of taxes are greater, or something else which they are doing which we are not? Is there a way?
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's going to be a new research. The impact of the fiscal conservatism on gender-related outcomes. There is no paper yet. And it's an important question, because what I thought in the beginning of my presentation, what I mentioned is that we have the macroeconomic policy framework, which is constrained to integrate gender because of the fiscal rules. So what we are doing is we try to identify specific policy tools like gender budgeting and get into the expenditure tools and try to map the outcome. So that was my starting point. But your feedback, it's quite precious. What you are arguing is that you work with the macroeconomic constraints coming from the fiscal conservatism itself and how it has impacted on the gender related expenditure outcomes. It's going to be, very tough, because one thing we can look into is the path in which the fiscal conservatism or the fiscal rules are attained in a particular country, whether it's through the tax buoyancy or through the expenditure compression. So the moment we are getting a result that it is not through the tax buoyancy, but through the expenditure compression that we reach the fiscal conservative or the fiscal threshold limits, then we have to look into the question, which kinds of expenditure compression or what kind of expenditure compression that has happened. And mostly the expenditure compression was in terms of capital spending, but in terms of human development related spending in the social sector, in the health and education, if it has happened, then again we need to disaggregate that further down and see the gender lens, to apply a gender lens to understand that how it has impacted the gender related things. And it's a very good research area, but nobody has looked into it. I have not seen a single paper across countries on this, and thank you for making that point, because I was thinking that I will keep that as a strict restraint framework and work with the specific policy tools like gender budgeting. But what you're arguing is you just look into the macroeconomic constraints itself from the fiscal rules and how it has impacted gender-related spending. So I will look into that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. I was just thinking through. I was trying to understand.
Yeah, it was very good. Thank you.
May I ask? I have just a couple of.
Yeah, Nilima, yeah, go ahead.
Do we have the time?
Yeah, sure.
First, of course, fantastic research. I think this is something which I also was grappling with in my own research on how much time women spend working unpaid, not just in care economy, but other kind of work as well, other kind of labor, and always very difficult to quantify. I think it's always been anecdotal, and I think this is the first time we are actually seeing a wonderful structure to this. I have Lekha, two questions which, one is, of course, I have in my own research, and I'm sure that others have done as well, there is an impact on the, let's say, the health costs of the woman or the household when she is having to spend more time working. And this is something which I'll also present in my own paper, that there is an increase in expense on her own health as well as nutrition and other indicators. Is there a way we can connect the two? I mean, not just the fact that the unpaid, unseen, invisible care economy, but also the costs of the extra work she does on her own health, nutrition, education, and other things. I say this because part of my research are also young girls who had to drop out of school at the age of 12 or 13 because they had to participate, they had to do labor. So is there a way we can quantify that? That was
thank you so much for this question.
I just had one more. The thing is that, okay, public policy, we know is not, it's an evolving thing, I agree. But your research, what does it say about the kind of your comment on gender budgeting or the way the government have been spending on women specific schemes?
Yes. Thank you. Actually, frankly speaking, the moment we take a health-related spending or a health policy in the context of India, it looks only into that clients or the patients, but it doesn't incorporate the care providers' perspectives. And we don't have any data on the care providers' perspective or the time or the psychic cost of the care providers, and that's a limitation, I agree. And I can feel that question, but we don't have the data, because the moment we get into the benefit incidence analysis of a public spending on health, we look into the hospitalization or the outpatient data. Correct. But not from that household care providers perspective. But this is very important. I agree to that, because the moment a state decides that it's going to decrease the spending on health, its burden is going to be on the care economy, and somebody is doing that work. But that kind of data generation that's not there, that care providers thing. But otherwise, it's a micro, the kind of study you are doing, it's at the micro level. But this perspective, I completely agree with you that it is not there integrated in the statistical system in our country and not there in the public policy making, that care providers perspective. And it is going to be quite huge when it comes to the COVID or any other kind of, things, the public health crisis when it comes, this question you asked is going to be very, very relevant. But that kind of data building or, because if you look at the spending, the access to the healthcare. So the moment we talk about the access to the healthcare, it's not about the health providers. So I really, appreciate your question. And in the context of Mexico, this question was asked because in Mexico, it was not a macro kind of a gender budgeting exercise. Theirs was a sectoral gender budgeting, and the sector they have preferred was health sector. So the question you asked was one of the prominent questions the Mexican, that research group has asked the government. But over the years, if you look at even in Mexico, where the gender budgeting sectoral initiative on health has happened, they also don't have this data, which is built in at the macro level, other than the micro level studies. So it's a gap. It's a gap in the data and in the policy making. The care provider's perspective or their time cost or their psychic cost, it's not at all integrated. And yeah, that's it. And I don't have an answer because we are not ready.
Thank you.
Thanks.